Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Global Population and Gender with Doris Forrester, and that's me. My next series of talks are going to be a little bit different than talks I've done in the past. In the past, I've looked at gender inequality in many different aspects and the vulnerabilities that women face that perhaps men don't face to the same degree. I've looked at global patterns and the reasons for these inequalities and vulnerabilities and why they exist, and maybe some potential solutions to those. In light of what's going on in the world in terms of global conflict and climate change and food insecurity issues, and I think a little bit more closer to home in terms of my country, is high inflation, and in my own city we have issues with affordable housing and homelessness. I thought I would shift gears a little bit and look at some positive initiatives that were happening in terms of gender inequality and what countries were doing to, narrow that gap between men and women in terms of political representation, economic opportunities, education attainment, and health. And let's see regionally what's happening. So my last talk before I'm doing this one, was looking at some laws that countries passed to specifically empower women or increase equality between men and women in a specific area. And so I thought from there I would look at regionally what was happening in different parts of the world to see what was happening in terms of gender equality. And I wanted to present some positive changes that were occurring. So the first region I'm going to look at is Latin America and the Caribbean. And the reason I chose this area is just I read an article looking at some of the gains women had made in this region, and I was curious, so I'm starting with this one. And so Latin America and the Caribbean are all the countries that are south of Mexico, and they include countries within North America and all of the countries of South America. And Central America and the Caribbean are actually part of North America, but they're often taken out and looked at as separate regions for various reasons. So a lot of the initiatives that the Caribbean and Latin America adopted or came up with to deal with gender inequality came out of this report, the Global Gender Gap Report in 2006. This was the first time a report like this was published, which surprised me because I knew that in the year 2000 in the Millennium Development Goals, there were 10 of them. One of them was gender equality, and 2015, when those goals became the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, gender inequality is one of those. So I was surprised that it took to 2006 to actually produce a report, but women have been fighting for equality for many, many years. So this report reports like this should have been published way earlier. We've been fighting for the right to vote, the right to work, the right for equal pay for equal work, the right to choose to have a baby or not. So I was surprised. But anyway, the information or the data that came out of this spearheaded the Latin America and the Caribbean to make some changes, which is good, which is a positive thing. So I did a talk a few months ago on these equality diamonds, and basically they measure equality between men and women in 4 areas: economy, education, politics, and health. And each area is given a score from between 0 and 1. 1 is full equality, 0 is inequality. And so globally, when they looked at the 115 countries that composed this report, they found that the score for economy was about a 0.6, for education was about a 0.8, politics was under 0.2, and health was over 0.9. So when we look at Latin America and Caribbean at the time in 2006, where they were positioned in terms of their performance of global gender, they were right in the middle. And so the countries that were ahead of them were just slightly ahead of them, and the countries that were below them or ranked lower than them were just slightly lower. So they were right in the middle. Where they were lacking or not scoring as high was in economic participation and opportunity. They were the 3rd lowest here. In terms of education attainment, they were quite high, equal to North America and Eastern Europe, and very close to the leaders. Regional performance on health survival, they were among the leaders. And Asia, that was just a tiny bit under them. Where they lacked or where they scored really low was regional performance for political empowerment, and you can see that it was well under a 0.2. So the highlights out of this report for Latin America and the Caribbean were that this region, Latin America itself, had the smallest gender gaps in the world for health and survival, and 14 countries from the region were holding the top spot of the context. Colombia, Jamaica, and Costa Rica had the highest ranking scores for the countries of the Caribbean, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And Jamaica was amongst one of the 12 countries out of the 115 that had achieved parity between men and women in education. So they closed that gender gap. Colombia and Costa Rica did very, very well in education attainment. They didn't score a 1 in political empowerment. And so you can stop the presentation right here and just take a look at the results from the 2006 report for these 3 countries. It'll give you their ranking, their score, and then their diamond. And so the blue is the country's results, and then the black is the average for the 115, and you can take a look at where they score. But I'm going to continue looking at some more of the highlights. Argentina scored 41, and they scored really high in health, education, and political empowerment. But where they lagged was in the economic participation and opportunity. And where they really lagged, and they had the widest range gap in wages between men and women for similar work out of the 115 countries, was in this area of income. So in 2006, a woman from Argentina made just over a third of what a man made in Argentina for equal work. And that is huge, huge, huge discrepancy between men and women. Brazil and Mexico were in the highlights because they had the largest populations and they also had very strong economies. But they didn't rank very high in terms of gender equality. Brazil and Mexico were the top in terms of the health. Brazil scored lower on education attainment and political empowerment, and Mexico was really lagging behind on economic participation and opportunity. And it's one of two things: they didn't have a lot of representation of women in the workforce, and there was a big wage gap between men and women. Chile and Guatemala scored the lowest out of the whole region. Chile at 78th position out of 115 countries, Guatemala 95. Chile had very high scores in health, and they had like mediocre results in education attainment and political empowerment, but where they were really scored poorly was in economic participation and opportunity. And Guatemala had the lowest, and they were really low with economic participation and opportunity in education attainment. So based on the results of that report and the data that was in that report for each specific country, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the member states are in the map on the right. And you'll notice that there's way more countries part of the commission than are actually part of the region. And I think the economic ties between all of these countries is the reason that the commission is much larger. And the goal is for economic growth of the region. So at their conference in 2007 for women in Latin America, the commission asked or requested for the creation of a gender equality observatory. And the reason they did that was they said that one of the key driving forces of democracy is parity. And in order to achieve equality in the exercise of power and decision making, we needed to eradicate women's structural inclusion in politics, economy, social, and cultural relations. And so because of that, they felt that this observatory would help. And so these are the objectives. So the observatory will analyze how each country is fulfilling the international gender equality goals and the targets by making strategic gender inequality indicators and tools for policy making available, maintaining up-to-date oversight of women's physical, economic, and political decision-making as it pertains to gender inequality by publishing reports every now and then that look at inequalities between men and women. And then they identified 4 areas that they wanted annual reports to look at the diagnosis of inequality between men and women. And they were paid and unpaid work, time use and poverty. So not just economic attainment, but they wanted specifically that, access to decision-making and political representation, gender violence, and health and reproductive rights. So those were the 4 areas, and those reports would then fuel the initiatives that many of the countries would adopt. So I'm going to fast forward to the Global Gender Gap Report 2020 and see if there's any gains being made, and then I want to look at what initiatives or what policies were in place that helped those gains be made. So if we look at this report, so from 26 to 2020, and I chose 2020 for a couple of reasons. One was that it was the year before COVID, and so a lot of the gains women had lost during COVID. And then it made direct comparisons to the first year, which was 2006. So the region had closed 72.1% of the gender gap, and you'll see that it's right here. So in 59 years, if current trends continue, the gaps in those 4 areas would be completely closed. And it's sad because I know I'm not going to be around for that. But it is the second lowest number after Western Europe, which is huge. They've made huge gains here. All 24 countries that are in this report they're within a 13.8 range between the highest, which was Nicaragua, and the lowest performing, which was Guatemala. So I put Nicaragua up here because I was amazed by their ranking change in 14 years from 62 to 5. They're in the top 10 now, and how much their score improved. And when I looked, you can see that they made huge gains in economic participation. But here, political empowerment is huge. They went from a ranking of 25 to a ranking of 3, which is huge. 15 countries have improved their overall scores, and 9 registered either they've stagnated their performance or a reversal from the year before. And amongst the most improved, it was Mexico, which gained 3.4% per year over the last few years. So when we look at Latin America, you can see what their score is, and then individually what their scores are. So they score very, very high still on education, attainment, and health. Political empowerment, they're only at a 0.15, so there's way more growth to happen there. And the economic participation is almost 6.5, not quite. So those gains have been small in a 14-year period, but some countries have made huge gains and some have not. So here's just an itemized list of the 25 countries that are in this report, their regional ranking, and then their global ranking. And so out of 153 countries, we can see that Guatemala is 113th, and their scores. So the highlights out of the 2020 report are health and survival. 13 countries have achieved full gender parity, and all countries have closed the gap, at least 97% of the gap. Education attainment is very similar. 11 countries have full parity, and the rest are within 97%, which is good. The other 2 areas, not so great. Economic participation opportunity, it really varies within the region. So there's a range from Bahamas, which is at an 83.8%. Okay, sorry, I made a little mistake. The dog came out. Okay, and in terms of political empowerment and gaps, there's large gaps. And in many countries of the region, they've shown some improvement, but there's a long, long way to go. This is the area that most countries need to really be working at. Costa Rica, Mexico, and Nicaragua have closed at least 46% of the gap in this subtext. Colombia, 31.8. 6 countries have stated that they've doubled their scores since 2018, but they are well below the 30% level. And in 2019, there were almost 50% of women parliamentarians in Bolivia, Cuba, and Mexico, and at least 50% of the women had ministerial positions in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. So now, quickly, I just want to look at the changes between 2006 to 2020 in the countries that I highlighted at the beginning of this talk. So what's to look at, a couple things to look at, is the rank between the two, the score, and then individually it looks at 2006 and 2020 and what their ranking is. So Colombia's, their position remained the same, 22nd, but more countries were added, and you can see the goal, the score increased, and then specifically you can look at gender, where they increased in political empowerment. Costa Rica, position 13 from position 30, and they made some gains in political empowerment and the economy. Jamaica lowered its rank, but just tiny gains in political empowerment and economic opportunity. Argentina, rank of a 30, but they made some small gains again. Brazil, small gains, rank of 92. Mexico, huge gains in political empowerment, huge, and that's why their ranking went to a 25, which is great. And then Chile and Guatemala, you can see where their gains are as well. And basically, it's the political empowerment. And that's all I have for today. Join me next time when we look at the actual initiatives that had some of these countries doing really well versus some not so well. So I'm going to say bye for now and have a great day.